Hi, I'm Melinda Kucsera, your indie fantasy author, and I'm back to read Chapter 13 of Curse Breaker Enchanted, so let's dive in right now. Chapter 13. I'll kill him. Ranaspera punched her palm, since her husband was out of reach. Are you sure? Inari shaded her eyes and scanned the horizon. Or is that all talk? I'll kill him, I swear it. The son of a bitch deserves it for what he did to Sarn. Ranaspera shifted her weight, causing the water-smooth stones to slide around under her boots. No moon rose as evening fell, leaving the tide to ebb and flow in a peaceful rhythm veiled by shadows. Ranaspera kicked the wave curling ashore, interrupting it. She hugged her anger to her, coiling it around herself so she could sick it on Grigori the instant the big lug set foot ashore. I can't believe he'd do something like this. I thought the last time was it, and there wouldn't be any more of this insanity. Ranaspera kicked a stone, sending it clattering down the gentle slope into the river. Bending, she seized several more, intent on throwing them too. We all thought so, Inari said. Her comment dragged Ranaspera around to face her friend. She dropped her ammunition, and the stones thudded onto the rocky beach. Before marrying Nolo, Inari had hunted the enchanted forest to feed her family. She'd traveled through most of Shiari with tinkers and tradesmen. Meanwhile, Ranaspera had never left Mount Eredrin's environs. Hell, I've never even visited Racine, and it's only 20 miles downriver. Ranaspera reflected wryly. So, Inari might be only a year older than her, but the woman had far more life experience. How could he do such a thing? Doesn't it bother him? It must bother him, even if it's only a little. I mean, after all Sarn's been through. Ranaspera pressed the heels of her hands into her eyes, but the image had burned itself into her retinas. A man with a bloody knife and the saddest eyes she'd ever seen had crouched over an unconscious Sarn. Blood had wept from a gash running the length of Sarn's face, and his dark hair had haloed his head, pillowed on that pitted stone floor. One arm and one leg had lain twisted at unusual angles to his body. He'd only been 15 then. Ranaspera rubbed her eyes, wiping away tears. Darkness spread its hands in the east, readying itself to grab the river valley and plunge it into night. Not a single bird took wing. No one loitered about either, save her, Inari, and a few others who had business with the harbor master. The flat ribbon of the river Nirtal reflected the empty sky oppressing her, and she shivered despite the May afternoon's warmth. Something felt wrong about all this beyond what her husband had done. I just can't put my finger on what. Inari squeezed Ranaspera's shoulder. Her dark eyes gave no hint of whether the image tortured her too. It must. The saint had nursed Sarn back to health. Seeing him day in and day out struggling with the most menial of tasks must have broken Inari's heart. Just thinking about the incident brought tears to her eyes. Ranaspera wiped them away. He'll be all right. He can fend for himself, Inari said. If the forest cooperates. But Ranaspera kept that worry to herself and said instead, Did you tell Nolo that? Of course. How'd he take it? Not well, as you can imagine. Silence fell, and not even the river dared to break it. Ranaspera kept her thoughts to herself and her eyes on the river. Something's coming, something big, shouted Nerul, Inari's 8-year-old son. He lay on his belly on the roof of the harbor master's abode with a spyglass pressed to one eye. Let me see! No, me! I want to see it too! Before the squabbling intensified and someone fell off the roof, Ranaspera whistled. Her nephews let go of the spyglass and covered their ears. Enough! Everyone will get a turn. Inari glanced to her son. Before she could utter a word, Nerul handed the spyglass to Jory, who sat to his right. Inari nodded, a half-smile quirking her lips in approval. It's a ship, Jory announced, then handed the spyglass to his brother. Ranaspera regarded her nephews. Both boys knew better than to indulge in any more roughhousing. She turned on her heel and stalked toward the dock to confront the inbound vessel. Grigori must be aboard. It was time the culprit returned. You think he's on that ship? Inari stirred but checked that impulse because someone must watch the boys. Oh, I know he is. He'll return as quickly as he can to see our reaction. You can bet on it. Where are you going? Ranaspera didn't answer. Grigori stepped off the gangplank and Ranaspera slammed her shoulder into his side, knocking him off balance. Locking her arms around his waist, she threw all her weight against him and he toppled into the river. Ranaspera sent the absent Sarn a thank you for teaching her stealth. The kid's 6th sense compensated for partial deafness in 1 year, making it tough to sneak up on him. But it was still possible with a little practice, and the practice had turned into a game. One the kid had enjoyed because it gave him something to do and a challenge to overcome. Having his mobility impaired by casts and crutches had added an extra layer of fun to the game. Everything had gone fine until they had taken the game outside. Ranispara shook those memories away and concentrated on her interrogation. Grigori hit the water and struggled against gravity. His limbs struck out in all directions in an uncoordinated jumble as he sank. Grigori shouted some nonsense about drowning. His protest gave her plenty of time to gain her feet. "Why did you do it?" Ranispara applied her boot to Grigori's chest and pressed down with all her weight. Grigori spat out water after a wavelet rolled over his head. "I can't swim!" Ranispara rolled her eyes. "Tell me something I don't know, like why you kidnapped Sarn. What's the kid ever done to deserve that?" Grigori grasped her ankle to shove her off him, but she had the advantage. "Let him up, please. You've made your point," Inari pleaded. Ranispara glanced at her friend over her shoulder. During all the drama, the boys had vacated their rooftop perch, and Inari had corralled them. Both of Ranispara's nephews stood slack-jawed and agog. Nerul tried to pry his mother's hand away from his eyes. While not pitch black like his father, Nerul's skin was the color of a good varnish. From his light-skinned saint of a mother, he'd inherited large, curious mahogany eyes, and one of those eyes stared at her from between his mother's long fingers. Ranispara had planned to interrogate her husband alone, but now she had an audience to consider. Perhaps it was time to revise her plan. "I had to do it, don't you see?" Grigori said between coughs. He spat out more water, but his struggles had all but ceased. Maybe he'd noticed the water only came to her knees. "No, I don't see, and you'd better make me or I'll let you drown, I swear it." Ranispara glared at her husband, letting her anger show. Under it lay other things, strong currents of conflicting emotions, but they had no place here. She laid a hand over the tangled mess throbbing in her chest and grimaced. "No, you won't." Jirla had an uncanny way of knowing what went on in and around Mount Eredrin, or he had a network of skilled spies. No one knew for certain which it was. Ranispara had expected him to drop in at some point. Later would have suited her better, but Jirlo operated on his own timetable, one he never deviated from, no matter how much it vexed his subordinates. "I said I would handle this. I said so this morning, but with all the stress and worry clouding your mind, accidents happen. This is an accident, right? One you'll rectify immediately." Jirlo glowered at them. Ranispara threw an angry glance at her boss. Jirlo caught and held her gaze, then dipped his chin once. His features had more fox in them now, and the fox stood ready to pounce. Perhaps he'd slept since this morning. "I've lost this round." It was time to hand her husband over to a higher authority, one who'd promised to make him pay for this outrage. Ranispara removed her boot from her husband's chest, slapped both hands on his head, and pushed. "You'd better expect a fight when Jirlo finishes with you." Ranispara splashed her way out of the river and slapped the post anchoring the dock in her way. Inari met her on shore with Nerul in tow. Since no one had paid them any mind, her nephews had stayed to watch the show. Nolo rushed across the beach and arrived just in time to haul Grigori up and demand, "Where is he?" "Not here." Grigori coughed and spat more water, then coughed some more. "We know." Jirlo clasped both hands behind his back and regarded the sky. Incensed, Ranispara jabbed her thumb into her chest. "You'll let him rough my husband up? I've earned the right to do it myself." Beside her, Inari covered her son's eyes and retreated. Her face betrayed her dilemma. Should she let Nerul watch an interrogation his father conducted, or should she take her son back to the mountain and miss hearing the reason behind all this drama? Inari also had a soft spot for Sarn. They all did, except for Grigori. Over the years, Sarn had invaded their hearts, becoming more than an indentured servant. Who said anything about roughing him up? Jirlo quirked one brow up. Nolo glanced at the commander, and his face reflected the same surprise as Ranispara's. Her lips flapped for a moment, then angry words poured out of her. "But we must! We need to know where Sarn is, and he's the only one who knows. Is he?" Jirlo turned on his heel, gesturing for Grigori to follow. "You know?" Ranispara shouted right over Nolo's protests. Jirlo halted, shaking his head while she and Nolo pelted him with questions and accusations. The commander's shoulders bowed until he cut them off. "Of course I don't know. I found out when you did about this mess." Jirlo's remark caught them both off guard. The lapping of the river sounded too loud in the sudden silence. "We need to know where he is." Nolo spread his hands wide in entreaty. "Yes, we must go get him," Ranispara seconded. She moved to stand closer to Nolo, but stalled out halfway there since her trajectory would have taken her too close to the dripping source of her ire. "Why, the kid's fine. He's making his way back here while we stand around jawing." Grigori rubbed the water from his face with his hands. Every drop he removed dribbled back into place thanks to his wet hair. Turning, he made eye contact with each of them while he renewed his argument. "The kid's a bit of a retard, yes, But his eyes aren't decorative. There's potent stuff in him, and we won't find out what that glow's done to him if we don't throw him to the wolves and see what happens." "You didn't!" Ranaspara stopped, appalled at the implication. "Maybe I did." Grigori tossed his wife an evil grin. Nolo hit him with a right cross. Grigori's head snapped back and he wobbled, but stayed on his feet. He was one tough guy. Nolo massaged his fist. "You'd better not have." Grigori rubbed his chin and gave his friend a look of respect. "Relax, I didn't involve any wolves. At least not intentionally, but you never know what's out there." "Tell us what you did with him," Ranaspara said as she shook out her fist. "We need answers, not more fisticuffs, but I want to slap that grin off his face." Grigori turned that shit-eating grin on her as if he'd read her mind. "I gave him a nice long walk to think about things. Maybe it'll improve his attitude." "What did you say to him?" Nolo clenched his fist for another go at his friend. "Nothing. He had a good nap and woke to find himself alone in the enchanted forest. If his sixth sense is as good as you think it is, he'll arrive soon. If he headed in the right direction." Grigori shrugged as if the outcome didn't matter. It did to her. Ranaspara stepped forward but stopped when Inari caught her eye. Her friend shook her head. "Not here," those dark eyes said. Inari was right. So Ranaspara stepped back in acknowledgement. "Enough!" Jurlo chopped a hand through the air. "There's nothing we can do but wait." "But a search party," Nolo said at the same time Ranaspara made a similar suggestion. "Now we're making progress." Ranaspara drew up plans but stopped when Jurlo shook his head and regrets creased his face. "We still don't know where to look." He raised his voice to talk over his lieutenants. "And I'll bet he doesn't know either." Jurlo nodded to Grigori. "But he must!" Flabbergasted at the direction the conversation had taken, Ranaspara took a step toward Grigori. "He must know." "Do you? Tell me true. Did you pay any attention at all to where you left the kid?" Jurlo asked. Grigori stood there for a moment, mouth agape. As the realization sank in, he blinked a few times and shook his head. "Exactly. He stopped the boat somewhere, got out, deposited the kid, then sailed back here." "How did you know?" Grigori asked. Jurlo ran a hand over the frizz ball standing in for hair. "Because I know you. I'll bet you boarded the first outbound vessel you found without checking the manifest. Pater is a good man and an even better harbor master. He was in his office the entire time with you. You had no opportunity to glance at his logs." Jurlo's lips quirked, then flattened back out into their customary line. "I'm right, aren't I?" Face flushed from embarrassment, Grigori nodded. "How did you know?" "I know you, and I know how you act. Your impulsivity is your downfall. Now come along. I have a punishment to mete out." Jurlo glanced at his second-in-command, then at Ranaspara, reading their intent. Ranaspara stood rigid as a pole. She refused to leave this beach until Sarn returned safe and sound. Nolo folded his arms over his chest and looked about as ready to budge as Mount Eredrin itself. Jurlo read their determination. "Good. You two organize watchers. I want eyes around the clock on the forest. Keep watch on the southeast. The kid will come from there." Jurlo's lips twitched again, but no smile appeared. "I checked the manifest after you reported to me. Rumors claim Captain Arjun's a smuggler. I read an illuminating report about a suspected landing around 30 miles southeast of here. I'm betting Grigori offloaded there." "We should fetch Sarn," Nolo said. "You think the kid is waiting around for rescue?" The brat learned early to fend for himself. No, he got moving the instant he realized what had happened. Jurlo shook his head. "If it'll make you feel better, send out patrols, but they won't find him unless he wants us to find him." "No, the next move is his. All we can do is wait and see how he plays it. We've got no other choice right now." One glance at Nolo's tense body and his clenched teeth proved he felt likewise, and that made Ranaspara feel a little better. "I know Jurlo's right, but I hate that he is. It's so unfair." Ranaspara wanted to argue the point, but she had nothing to gain by it. So she let it go and turned her gaze southeast to the forest, banishing her husband and her boss from her sight. Doubt niggled at her. Will Sarn return, or did Grigori's betrayal destroy what little trust he had in us? "I don't like it." Nolo unfolded his arms. Turning, he faced southeast and let his troubled gaze roam over the enchanted forest until the Queen of All Trees showed herself. White light flowed from her, making the concentric circles of menhairs gleam before she vanished into the distant tree line. "Neither do I," Jurlo said, dragging Nolo back to the conversation at hand. The commander gave no hint of whether he'd seen the Queen of All Trees, but it's what we're stuck with. "You're using this to test him. You won't authorize the search because you don't think he'll return." The words flew out of Nolo's mouth before he could stop them. A flash of silver moved through a forest that was too dense for the sun's rays to pierce, and his heart caught. Was the Queen of All Trees also searching for Sarn? Oh God, no. Leave the kid alone. He belongs here. If she heard his silent injunction, she gave no sign. "I don't know what goes on in that boy's head." Jurlo turned away from the forest and the conversation. Nothing good, I'd wager, Grigori said. Not true. Ranisbara turned and shook her head. I agree with Ranisbara, Inari said, speaking for the first time. He's got a good heart, and he made a promise. He'll return. You haven't seen the last of him. We'll see. For now, you and I need to have a chat. Jurlo gave Grigori a look which had caused sterner men to quake. He gestured for the larger man to follow and took his leave. Nolo regarded the forest. Did I imagine seeing the Queen of all trees? The forest tangling on both sides of the river seemed darker without her and more hostile. He recoiled from it. Somewhere out there, Sarn's working his way back here, slogging 1 mile at a time, and he probably thinks we abandoned him. All the trust Nolo had built with the kid threatened to collapse, and he could do nothing to stop it. What now? Ranisbara moved to stand by him. Nolo glanced at her. Had she seen the Queen of all trees? If she had, she hid it well. Is there any leeway in his high and mighty's orders? Ranisbara tucked a loose lock behind her ear. There's always leeway. Nolo just needed to find it. Then spell it out for me, because I don't see it. My head's still spinning. Before Nolo could answer, Ranisbara seized her fleeing nephews. They wore the colored sashes of the Messengers Guild over their sweat-stained clothes. Hold that thought. I'll be right back. There's something I need to deal with. She escorted her nephews behind the harbor master's office for an overdue chat. He'll come back, Nerul said. The boy had met Sarn because an illiterate, unskilled youth recovering from 10 broken bones had limited uses. Babysitting a small child had been just the thing to keep Sarn occupied. It might not be up to him. Nolo turned to face his son. What are you doing down here? What do you mean by that? Inari rested her hands on her son's shoulders. Nolo shook his head. They didn't see the Queen of all trees, nor do they know about her interest in Sarn. A shudder tore through Nolo at the memory, and he mashed his lips into a thin line, walling himself off from his wife and child. They don't need to know. In response, Inari's entire manner hardened, but she remained silent. Ignoring the Cold War between his parents, Nerul held up a spyglass and answered his question. I'm keeping watch for Sarn. He'll come back. Will he? Nolo wasn't certain, but he didn't dash their hopes. I also want to believe he'll return. And that was Chapter 13. Let's do Chapter 14, and let's see if Sarn does return. Chapter 14. Sarn raced west by northwest, guided by his head map and a steady tug on his heart toward his son. As he ran, the sack of all fruit beat a muffled tattoo on his back, narrowing his world to the ground in front of him. Nothing else mattered except reaching his son before the thing infecting the forest did. Ahead, trees whose bases were as wide as 30 men sidled toward each other. Sarn broke into an all-out run and just squeezed between those hulking behemoths before their trunks touched. What the hell is the forest doing? More trees sidled toward each other, but Sarn slid between them, turning sideways to fit. Get out of my way! Sarn shouted as he veered to miss another tree scuttling on its roots right into his path. As he ran, the ground inclined, and he tripped over loose rocks in his haste. I must keep going. Magic wrapped hot hands around his ankles, supporting Sarn as he slipped on a mossy rock. All around him, trees twined their branches together, weaving a wall he couldn't outrun. Sarn skidded to a halt and glared at the trees blocking his path. Let me pass! He shouted at them, but not a single leaf twitched. I must reach my son. Why won't you let me? Sarn pounded his fists into their trunks, but they refused to budge. Creaking behind him signaled they'd cut off his escape. They hemmed him in on all sides, trapping Sarn miles from anywhere, and no one knew where he was. Panic flared at that thought, but he squelched it. I must stay calm and rational. Roots scraped the leaf mold aside, revealing a dirt surface. They beckoned, inviting him to come closer. When Sarn hesitated, a root scratched a symbol in the earth. Sarn stared at proof of the forest's intelligence. A mind drove this display, but was it a hive mind, or did each tree have a mind of its own? Both had frightening implications, so he put both questions out of mind. I don't want to know. Knowing won't help me escape, and that's what I need to concentrate on. The ghost boy pointed at the symbols, agitated by their presence. What is it? Sarn pointed to the first symbol. The roots wiped it out and redrew it. Sarn regarded the broken circles. What does this mean? The roots traced something on the periphery, but without more concise tools, the addition made no sense. Sarn gave up asking when every question ended in the same result, the roots stabbing at a bunch of incomplete circles. I don't know what you're trying to tell me, and I don't have time to find out. Let me pass. I must reach my son. Sarn pushed against one of his sylvan jailers, but it didn't budge. To his left, the ghost boy lobbed a rock into the shadows. What do you see? The ghost launched another stone. Sarn scanned the shadows, but this time no rats, roaches, or other vermin populated them. Maybe the ghost just frustrated with my lack of progress. Well, if they won't let me through, maybe I can just go over them. Sarn tilted his head back and tried to estimate how high the lowest branches were. Maybe 100 feet? Too high for him to climb without magical assistance. But will I get it? He waited, but his magic didn't offer a correction or to help. As if they read his mind, the north-facing trees winched themselves closer together and lifted their lowest branches even further out of reach. Sarn checked his head map. The river Nirthal lay to the north, and so did Mount Eredrin, but he couldn't go that way. 4 red icons blossomed on his map. Sarn dove to the side as a branch stabbed the spot where he'd just stood. A tar-like substance oozed out of the crack in its bark as the corrupted tree wiggled its trapped bough, but the earth held fast to it. Sick, commented his magic. Tell me something I don't know, like why this is happening. Sarn waited, but his magic had gone silent again. Sarn put the question aside for now. A gut-churning wrongness was leaking out of his attacker and seeping into the ground, not a good sign. Behind it, 3 more infected trees lumbered up, and the enchanted trees barring his way sparred with them without shifting locations. Damn them. Sarn tried to squeeze past his captors, but it was too late. The infection had spread to the ground under him, and it spawned grabby hands. While he dodged them, he searched for a way out. I must get out of here before that black stuff infects me too. And it will. That crud's hunting for me. Sarn spotted a narrow gap on the west side. He slid through it and took off in a dead run up an incline. But the corruption shot through the earth, liquefying it under his feet. Sarn leaped. A wet tentacle seized his ankle, but he leaned into the fall, turning it into a roll. Momentum snapped his attacker's grip. Thanks to his magic and a well-timed somersault that took him out of reach of the monster's next grab, Sarn landed boots first on a boulder and exploded into a series of round-offs. Midway across the brook, he glimpsed a faceless giant made of mud, and he gaped at it. Thank fate his head map had plugged into his hands and guided them to the next stone jutting out of the swift-moving water, or he would have missed it. Sarn landed on the far side as that mud creature dove and merged with the brook's bed. Its gut-twisting wrongness nauseated Sarn as he turned and ran for the river Nirthal. He still had to cross that major waterway to reach his son, and that wouldn't be a fun swim with a sick stomach. Enchanted trees shuffled past Sarn, heading towards their infected brethren, but he veered around them. They swung at the mud creature, slicing it in half, and then there were 2 monsters chasing him. Sarn cursed and traded hiking for climbing when a rock wall interrupted his route. The ghost boy popped up and shook his head and chopped his hands through the air. Sarn skidded on loose stones and just barely avoided another collision with the specter. Why don't you want me to go this way? It's not like I have a choice. At least a dozen mud creatures staggered toward him now. Stop making more. You're not helping the situation. Sarn shouted over his shoulder at the trees, but they ignored him and kept hacking and slashing with single-minded determination. Maybe they weren't intelligent enough to notice they weren't winning. The ghost opened his mouth, but no sound emerged since a veil of silence divided the dead from the living. Sarn rubbed his burning eyes with the hand not anchoring him to the rock wall, and his map took that as an invitation to manifest. A new icon blinked red up ahead. It can't be worse than what's chasing me. So Sarn dug his fingers into the cracks and scaled a vertical cliff. While he ascended, green sparks shot over his hands and up his shaking arms. His newly energized muscles tingled in response, and the sensation distracted Sarn from his head map. Facts and figures he'd become adept at ignoring scrolled past, exacerbating the ache throbbing behind his left eye. Something touched his mind, then flitted away as his magic read every rock he touched. Sarn shook his head to clear it of the double vision. Then the rock under his hands reshaped into hands many times larger than his own. Those granite hands seized him, and an image shot through his head. The army of mud creatures were gaining on him, but at least they were still blobby, shambling things. Maybe they aren't intelligent enough to coordinate an attack, but I'd rather not find out. Nor would he, since his latest captor offered an escape and followed it up with another silent inquiry. Yes, I understand, Sarn sent back. The rock hands extruded arms and swung. At the apex of its third swing, it let go, and Sarn somersaulted onto a narrow precipice. Below, stone fists punched out, knocking the mud creatures down. How long before those vile things make that climb? Sarn swung his leg over the side and dropped onto another ledge. His map had pointed out. It knifed away from the rock formation and extended about a dozen feet out. Alarm bells rang in his head. What is it now? Didn't I deal with enough weird things today? He had, but Sarn obeyed the warnings and crawled out to the edge to investigate. The ground dropped away in a steep valley. At least 500 feet down, a group of orange-robed people boarded a small craft. He lost sight of the boat when it sailed behind a cluster of trees. A few minutes later, the boat reappeared, arrowing toward a long boat anchored offshore. Nolo once said something about orange robes and danger. What religious order wore orange robes? Not a good one, if Nolo had warned about them. Could they be part of this? A burning desire to know what he'd stumbled onto overrode caution. Sarn dropped onto a smaller ledge to access a rough trail sneaking down to the river. Halfway to the ground, Sarn tripped when the ghost reappeared. It waved its arms in a frantic negation while Sarn scrabbled for a handhold. He slid toward a 250-foot drop according to his magic, which had popped the numerical digits into his peripheral vision. "You're not helping," Sarn told it right before he jerked to a halt. Either by chance or by magical intervention, his sleeve had caught on a spur of rock. Sarn wrapped his fingers around it, and his magic finally roused. Green light leaked out of his hands, turning them sticky. Sarn reeled himself in until he had a stable perch on an outcropping the size of his rump. He checked his back trail, but it remained clear of monsters for now. "Thank you." He patted the rock supporting his weight, grateful it was keeping his foes occupied. The boat returned, and more acolytes boarded it. No flashes of orange on shore meant the larger vessel would cast off soon. "If I can reach the beach before it does, I'll have an unobstructed view." Maybe he could figure out who they were and what they were up to, because they were up to something. I don't believe in coincidences. Turning, Sarn touched the vertical rock wall. Light attracted light, and his glowing hand warmed as the contact firmed. Since the fall had ripped his trousers, he applied his bare knee to the rock, adding a third point of stability. His right boot hit a stone protrusion, and it bore his weight. Good. Now to make like a spider and crawl. Sarn descended until he could jump the remaining distance. Once on the beach, he rushed to the water's edge, but the longboat had cast off already. Its profile faded into the setting sun framed by the gorge. It's late afternoon of what day? Sarn dropped his head into his hands. A weekday, he cursed. Myron had school from 9th until 16th bell. In exchange for food, the foundlings babysat his son, but this morning, a jerk with a grudge had kidnapped him before he'd fetched their breakfast. Grigori, that jerk. Sarn punched the rock wall. Magic sheathed his fist mid-air, protecting it from the blow. Rocks tumbled down, forcing him to stumble backward into the river to avoid a concussion. Sarn flexed tingling fingers before lowering his hand to his side. A small hand tugged his heart, and the wind whispered his son's name. Ran was a white star shining in the darkness of his head map. "Are you in trouble, son? Did that corruption reach you?" It could have, and Sarn had no way to know. "Maybe there's a way I can find out." "Papa, come back!" "I'm trying to." Sarn reached into his map and didn't stop until his fingers skimmed the white star marking his son. Pain hammered a nail between his eyes, but he couldn't stop. He must know if his son was all right. So he kept reaching through the dark patches and the newly sketched contour lines of the cliff he'd just descended into the magic within him and beyond. His map flickered in response, then exploded in a shower of sparks. Something dripped down his lips. Sarn tasted blood as the ground trembled, and the world grayed out. "Where are you, Papa?" Ran asked, but his voice came from far, far away. Ran! The name ripped out of Sarn and left a ragged wound behind. "Papa!" At his son's tearful call, Sarn shifted from here to there and landed in a heap of elbows and knees. A small shape appeared silhouetted against the white light blinding him. Pain blew the top of his head off. Sarn screamed, and emerald-tinged darkness dragged him down into its hungry maw. "What are you writing?" Ran fingered the rocks scattered around him. Each one had a story, and they all reminded him of Papa. Papa had been gone for a long time. Uncle Myron scratched his pen on the paper in front of him and ignored Ran and his question. Ran crawled to the straw tick. He sniffed until he found Papa's scent: old wood, stale sweat, and crushed pine needles. The spicy undercurrent of magic tied it all into an aromatic package he found comforting. Papa had never stayed away for so long. Bear looked at him with concerned button eyes and extended his furry arms. Ran fell into them and remembered Papa's gift tucked safely in Bear's belly pouch. Bear remembered them too, and they squeezed out of his belly pouch into his eager hands. Ran spun those seeds and let their soft filaments tickle his fingers. "I wish Papa would come back." "Why aren't you here, Papa?" Ran sat up. The air felt lighter, warmer even. Something had changed. "Is Papa coming?" Sometimes Papa's magic preceded his arrival. When it didn't dive into the cave, Ran listened hard for the quiet tread of Papa's boots and willed the door to open. A hazy outline of a man fell through the closed door. White and emerald fire edged his being, but he was long-limbed like Papa. His magic infused his cloak, pooled around him, and it glowed. "Papa!" Ran crashed into the translucent heap on the threshold, and Papa's magic enfolded him in warmth, brilliance, and love. Joy exploded in his chest as powerful arms wrapped around him. Pine needles brushed Ran's face. Their cave vanished, leaving a purple after image that slowly faded into a creepy gray place. Shadows sketched gnarled branches overhead. Then they too streaked past. Everything faded away, but it didn't matter because Papa was back! Ran hugged Papa as hard as he could. Far away, Ran heard the rustling of papers and the scratching of his uncle's quill. In time with Papa's heartbeat, magic and light strobed around them. But it was the wrong color. White and green light poured out of Papa's eyes as two kinds of magic clashed. Their struggle for dominance charged the air as two luminous bubbles pounced on him, a white one and a green one. They fought to cup him in their radiant protection. Ran smiled at the attention. Ran? Papa's grip loosened and his arms fell away, releasing Ran. Were the dueling powers hurting Papa? Worry pushed Ran back a step, and he gasped. In Papa's eyes, two conflagrations battled it out, one white and one green. But Papa's eyes only ever glowed green. They usually had non-glowing white parts and a black spot in the center, but both were missing. Papa, you look funny. Your eyes are all wrong. Ran's shoulder passed through Papa's chest when he bumped it. Papa screamed and collapsed, clutching his head. When Papa hit the ground, he vanished. Their cave materialized around Ran, darker than before. The two orange Lumiere crystals lay on the table by Uncle Myron, but their glow was weak compared to Papa's brilliance. Who are you talking to? Your father isn't here, Uncle Myron said without looking up from his homework. He was just here. No, he wasn't. You were talking to shadows. Ran shook his head. Where had Papa gone? Papa, come back! Threads of magic drifted in the musty air, and Ran twined his little fingers in them. He walked backward, wrapping those glowing threads around his body, and ignored his uncle. Since his uncle had ignored him for the last few bells, that was only fair. Ran gave the remnants of Papa's magic a good tug and smiled. He had a line on his missing Papa. Ran curled up with Bear and clutched those shimmering cords. He pulled on the promise binding them, reminding Papa he was waiting. Bear's button eyes approved. But after a few minutes of asking questions Ran ignored, his uncle threw his hands up in disgust. Muttering something about ungrateful brats, Uncle Myron slammed his book on the table. Score one for Team Bear. Ran hid a grin in Bear's furry belly, and maybe a giggle or two at getting a rise out of his uncle. A stray tear or two might have snuck down his cheek and dripped onto Bear's soft nap, but Bear would never tell a soul about them, especially not Uncle Myron. A roach scuttled across the mattress. It shared Uncle Myron's bad attitude. Concentric rings of red winked in and out of sight around the bug until Bear swatted it away. It was a bad thing, Ran said. Bear nodded. Antennas explored a pile of clothes tangled in the remnants of Papa's magic. Come back, Papa, Ran begged as he felt a tug on the tie binding them. Something bad gnawed at it. Papa must return before it broke or he wouldn't be able to. Wake up, boy. A hand slapped Sarn, jarring him out of sleep. He stared straight into the eyes of his torturer. You're dead! Hadrival smirked and faded out. A branch sliced through the spot the orphan master had occupied, then withdrew as the enchanted oaks bending over him lashed out, blocking another attack. Shaken by what he'd seen, Sarn lay there, wincing at the pain throbbing in his brow. Tentative probing revealed no external cause for the pressure squeezing his head. Did I imagine Hadrival, or is his ghost haunting me too? When Sarn tried to sit up, his map tackled him, knocking him flat. He gritted his teeth as the map zoomed out to display a 20-mile swath of the River Nirthal Valley. A fixed star pointed out his sun, and it flickered, demanding his attention. So did a half-dozen unrecognizable icons converging on his position. Likely they were possessed trees or mudmen or both. Damn Grigori and his tests! How could he do this to me and get away with it? And why did he pick today of all days? Grigori, you selfish prick! Sarn punched the ground, and last year's leaves muffled the thud it made. He shoved the map aside so he could rise without banging into any of the branches slashing at things outside their cordon. His map refused to minimize or become translucent. Instead, it obscured one eye, forcing Sarn into a half-blinded stumble along the River Nirthal's bank while he fumbled for an all-fruit. Of course, Mount Eredrin would lie on the opposite shore. Pain still tapped hot spikes into his head, but its vice loosened a little more with every bite of the all-fruit. Sarn stopped when the tide rolled over his boots, soaking them. No, screamed his magic as it recoiled from the river. Yes, said an unfamiliar voice in his head. Perhaps that other magic? Sarn shuddered. On his map, his sun's star brightened, calling to him. I'm coming, son. Aim higher, Aratar. That fell voice cut across the conflict raging behind the line of trees, silencing it. As Sarn pivoted, dropping the all-fruit core, the sun dropped behind a cliff, plunging the shore into shadows. Black mud oozed between the enchanted trees in quivering, man-shaped lumps. The ghost boy shot past those fell creatures, dodging their still-forming arms, and slammed into Sarn, knocking him backward into the river. Water dragged Sarn under. Its frigid touch quenched the fire burning behind his eyes, snuffing out their glow. Green magic retreated deep into his body, away from its enemy. In its wake, another power roused, sensing a vacuum. But Sarn shoved it down too and kicked for the surface. He clawed at the water and fought the tide as he surfaced. What's stirring inside me? I only have one type of magic. Sarn caught glimpses of the world without the magic's green filter as he blinked to clear the water from his eyes, and it was a little too magenta for his liking. The forest on the north bank beckoned to him as he spat out a mouthful of water. A black pyramid squatted a half-mile down on the mud creature-infested shore he'd just left. They ignored the obsidian monstrosity fashioned long ago by Litharian hands and stared right at him as they dove into the riverbed. Why are those things after me? A mountain overshadowed that ziggurat, and its lopsided cone was familiar. What's 20 miles east of Mount Eredrin? Is it Racine? Sarn cursed. Of course it is. What test would be complete without the risk of discovery? Damn Grigori to the coldest pit of hell for this. A white shape swam past, startling Sarn. It was just the ghost boy, and it was trying to gaze-lock him. No! Sarn closed his eyes, and the tide pushed him toward Racine and discovery. Chilly hands plucked at his clothes. They tugged his clothes as he swam on, fighting the river. Sarn checked the mud creature's progress. They pushed on a tree close to the riverbank, intent on toppling it, but its neighbors were fighting back. There was still no sign of the mud creatures who'd merged with the river's 3-mile-wide bed. They might beat me to the opposite shore, and there was nothing he could do about that except be ready to face a hostile welcoming party. Fan-frickin-tastic. Sarn cursed. The last few hours of insanity must be related to the events of last night, but he just couldn't see the connection. Then he was underwater again, shoved there by the ghost boy pushing on his shoulders. Why me? A few powerful strokes pushed his head above the water line again. When the ghost shoved again, he didn't sink, but this entire episode reminded Sarn of one of his son's favorite games. Does the ghost just want to play with me? His mind rejected such reasoning, but his heart accepted it. A few days ago, the ghost had been a living child, and children like to play. Rand can turn anything into a game. Why would a ghost child be any different? We can play later. I must reach the other shore. Ignoring his plea, the ghost plowed into Sarn, and something grazed his ankle. Was it one of those mudmen? Could they manifest underwater? Is there a monster in the river? The ghost boy nodded and waved Sarn to hurry. They'd almost reached the northern shore. Sarn clambered onto the riverbank, and his magic swept the rocky beach. No corrupted trees or mudmen jumped out to slash him, but for a moment a face grinned at him from the depths before the waves washed it away. Sarn hurled a rock at Hadrival's hated visage, then shook his head. Lack of sleep is making me hallucinate. Hadrival is dead. He can't be part of this. And standing around while he lost his mind wasn't an option. Sarn had 4 hours until his shift began, and someone noticed his absence. The wind cut through his wet garments, making Sarn shiver. Grigori will pay for this. Magic pulsed under the earth, clean and welcoming. Come, run with me, it whispered, vibrating his bones. And why shouldn't I use the magic no one wants me to use? It might get me back to my son faster than running alone. But the old fear uncoiled and asked the one question Sarn feared above all. What will that do to you? Your mother was a whore. You don't know where your magic came from. That was true. Sarn rubbed at the pain in his chest and fought down the fear with a more pressing truth. I don't have any other choice. It's too far to run without help, and his magic offered that help. His son's absence was an ache that wouldn't go away until he held the boy close to his heart. I must do this for my son. Sarn shucked his boots, knotted the laces together, and draped them over his shoulder. He dug his toes into the earth before the fear could return. Magic seeped into his soles, warming his feet as his connection to the earth set energy tingling up his calves, doubling and tripling the power he could call upon, and that felt right. More magic in the earth meant more enchanted trees and other flora weaving an impassable mess and likely more corrupted things to dodge. I don't have time to deal with any of that right now. Papa? Rand's voice faded as it reverberated. Small hands tugged on Sarn's heart, jerking him towards his son. The world faded to gray. Purpose crystallized into a lens, focusing his magic as emerald fire arced out, connecting his goal to his destination. That old fear spiked, whispering all the self-limiting things that had convinced Sarn in the past to bottle his magic up and leave it alone. But Rand needs me, and his need will keep me anchored, so I'm not lost in the magic's thrall. Sarn let go, and magic spilled out, hot and electric, sweeping away his sanity. Papa, come back! Rand's fearful voice trailed off. I'm coming. Hold on, son. Sarn gave the enchanted tangle before him a baleful glare. The trees refused to budge. Green lightning crackled along his arms as Sarn threw them wide. Magic cascaded out of his hands, forming a sparkling green wedge that slammed into the trees, blocking his path. Get out of my way! The ground quaked as the forest parted, creating a straight path to Mount Eredrin, 20 miles distant. Magic pushed up through the soles of his feet, catapulting Sarn 10 times further than his usual stride through a tunnel of trees. Hold on, son. I'm coming. And that's chapter 14. Yes, Sarn did almost teleport. That is exactly what happened in that scene, so if that's what you thought, you were correct. teleporting is actually something that is within Sarn's capabilities. He doesn't know it at this time, but as long as he's not trying to cross water, he could use his magic to transport himself to various places around Shayari, but he'd have to know his destination ahead of time. Like, there are some rules surrounding this, but we obviously didn't get into that in this one, and we don't really need to, because Sarn was only trying to go from where he was to a place that he knows very well, which is his cave under the mountain. That would have been well within his capabilities if he knew how to do it correctly, which obviously he didn't because it didn't quite work. There's a little bit more involved in it than just sort of picking your destination, grabbing the magic, and going, but maybe not a whole lot. So that is something that he will do in later books when he gets the hang of it. Something to watch out for. So we'll find out when we return next time, when we pick up with chapter 15, if he reaches Mount Eredrin and what happens when he does, because he'll have to face Grigori at some point, so that should be interesting. And as I said before, if you want to read ahead or read along, Curse Breaker Enchanted is available as an ebook and auto or AI narrated or digitally narrated. I've seen it called a lot of different things. Audiobook, and I think his voice sounds a lot better than mine does. But maybe I'm biased. So you can check that out. There's links in the show notes or the description, depending on where you're listening to this. And yeah, otherwise we'll see you back. Make sure to share, like, follow, do all the things. And I will see you next time. This is Melinda Kucsera, and I am your epic fantasy author. Have a good one.